Alright guys, we're back. Probably the last video. I reserve the right to add another one if I don't cover everything. This one's going to be short. In the previous video we talked about static lighting, baked lighting, how light maps works. We talked about, let me double check to make sure I did everything. We talked about light map resolution. We talked about light map optimization and how that works. We talked about light mass. We talked about the swarm agent. We talked about the light mass importance volume. When would you need a light mass importance volume? Only if you are going to be doing any kind of light baking. If you are going to be lighting using fully movable lighting, you don't need a light mass importance volume. I'll show you guys here in this particular demo. We talked about movable objects and what happens to them in a static lighting scenario. And finally, I mentioned what would be a use case for static lighting. And that's honestly the lowest of the low bar of rendering for lighting for games on maybe mobile that cannot handle any of the fancy stuff that we're going to be throwing at ourselves here in the next couple classes. That's pretty normal. Let's talk about the other mobility settings. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this sphere Walking Dude. I'm going to press F2 to bring up the icon here. Walking Dude. And we're just going to pretend this is a walking dude so that we don't have to worry about that. He'll just walk around and he'll be a walking dude. Let's go ahead and change our mobility setting from our directional light from static to stationary. Once you change that lighting setup, immediately do a bake. Unless you already know what's going to happen, like I do in most cases, and then, yeah, you don't have to bake immediately. But this is for you guys. You guys are students. You guys are still trying to figure it out. It's fine. We're going to move kind of quick here. Stationary lights are the default lights inside of Unreal. If you are using Lumen, stationary lights are going to calculate as movable on basically everything, and it's going to cast a movable light, meaning the light is generated and realized on every frame. Stationary has properties of a static light and properties of a movable light, and is the generalist light for basically everything. Setting movable just means that you're never going to use light maps, is basically it. But a good example of a stationary light is, hey, look, objects that are flagged as movable in a stationary light setup. The walking dude here says, hey, light, I am a movable light, and you are a stationary light. Can I cast a shadow? And then the stationary light, which is our directional light here, because it's at stationary, is like, yeah, go ahead. But you're the only thing that's going to get a moving shadow. Everything else in this scene that's flagged as static or stationary. Typically, objects aren't stationary. It's weird. Objects that are stationary generally can be changed but not moved. It's very strange. Not too weird, but objects either move or don't move. So a stationary object might change colors or change intensity or change lighting, but typically speaking, if we have like a building here, set it to static. There's no reason why it shouldn't be static. It's going to be static. It's not going to move, right? Objects are static or movable. I don't find a case very often where objects are stationary unless they specifically need to do something on their material where they can change that material quickly, right? But then that's usually a light. But anyways, I digress. These two objects now see each other, and they're like, well, they're not the same. We have a movable object in a stationary lighting setup. The stationary light says, yes, you can move, but you are the only thing that's going to cast a real-time light and a real-time shadow. Your shadow is going to be the most expensive thing. In fact, I'm going to bring that up. Let's see if I remember where that is. Where are my... Is that going to be in my thing here. Give me a sec to look it up here. Let's see, where did they move it? Oh, we have Lumen scene now. Advanced should be, there it is, shadow frustums. Does everybody see what's happening with that shadow here? I have my directional light selected. Does everybody see this box here? This box indicates, hey, I'm a moving object. That means I get to cast a real-time shadow, but with some caveats. As we move further away, we see that that shadow disappears because it's trying to optimize what is happening with our shadows, right? It's trying to optimize, hey, make sure that the shadow that's being cast performs well enough so that if we move far away from this shadow, we can still continue to get good performance. One thing, however, to keep in mind is we can affect this distance as well. Down here under cascaded shadow maps, we can change the dynamic shadow distance on a stationary light to increase how far away we can be before the shadows disappear. Usually you can tighten that or tune that as you see fit, depending on how far you want the frustum to kind of appear. But you see kind of how that works overall. You can increase the distance, so to speak. You can see how much more accurate that shadow gets depending on that dynamic shadow distance. Again, what we're doing is we're visualizing the shadow frustum, and we're seeing where the light is coming from. Let me make sure I'm actually recording that. Yes. We see that the light is coming at us. That's the light that's being calculated at us. And we see that this shadow frustum, that's what that is, that's what it's called when we are developing it. We see that we can tweak that so that we can get the shadow to appear at a very far distance. Granted, there is some fall off to where eventually the shadow does get less than a few pixels. So on my screen, it's probably maybe like 12 pixels right there. There's a maximum amount that you can expect from something like this. But that gives you an idea of how you can control how that shadow is going to work. Not something you guys are going to have to worry about, but worth keeping in mind. Now, I'm going to keep the shadow frustums on for now so that we can see them a little bit easier. But I'm going to turn the dynamic distance back to its default value. And we can see that it does affect the way that the ground looks as well. What is happening here? One of the benefits of a static light in a non-lumen setup, excuse me, a stationary light in a non-lumen setup, is you get, where are they? There it is. You get what is called a cascaded shadow map. So it's kind of like a higher resolution light map. It uses the same settings. Notice that we now have 3 times. We had 6 light maps, and now we have 18. We have 6 times as many light, or excuse me, 3 times as many light maps than we did before. That's because a stationary light agrees with some objects. Static objects will get a higher quality, not necessarily dynamic, but a casted shadow from an object that is generally referred or generally seen as being higher quality. So under static lighting, you get just a baked light with no cast shadows. Under stationary light, you get casted shadows, and you also get light maps. So you get both. that combination oftentimes is good enough to give a realistic light setup. Now again, bear in mind, we're still not using Lumen yet. We disabled Lumen at the beginning of this demo, just to keep that in mind. And that's really it. This is really all there is to it. The scene is now set up for a stationary setup. We don't have to change a whole lot. We're getting higher, crispier, better looking shadows. Objects that are movable cast a movable shadow. We see that the shadow frustums verify that. We showed that we can modify and correct the shadow if the shadow goes into places that we want it to be more visible, right? And that's pretty much the basic of a stationary light. The advantage here of a stationary light is that we can change things like intensity within reason, obviously. We can change the intensity, and we can change the color, and it's not going to need a rebuild. But, there's always a but. Remember what happened in the previous lighting setup where it baked the color of the light into the scene? Is that not what's happening here? That's exactly what's happening here. Let me do a quick build and I'll showcase that. I have to show that. Maybe I won't give you guys homework this week. We'll see. I might have to just because it's going to be good for you guys. I might give you guys this scene, so you guys can do that. Ah, there we go. Look at that. And if we set the lighting back to default, it's the same problem, just more intense because the cascaded shadow maps get that baked shadow at a higher quality level. And you see that the object is remembering, hey, there was a pink shadow here a second ago. What's going on? Yeah, that's kind of the negatives. But for example, once I get my lighting set up, let's say this is like an escape room and like there's a flashing light and it's supposed to be creepy and scary while this is baking. I'm going to have I shouldn't have baked before I put that in it, but I'm gonna make a point light and I'm just going to bring that light in. Ignore the shadow frustum. It's just, you know what? I just shouldn't have it on. That's probably just going to confuse the heck out of you guys. So let's go ahead and advanced. Visualize. No, it's under advanced. It's under shadow frustum. Disable that. I'm going to have this light, lighting build completed. Apply now. It's fine. Let's say this light is supposed to be like an alarm light, so I have like a let's say I have an asset over there that is shaped like a light. Ooh, map check found some errors. Oh, one lighting needs rebuilt. Yeah, that's stationary. That's cool. And let's say this light is going to do this. I'll dismiss that for now. And this light is going to do this the entire game. You can do that with a stationary light. You cannot do that with a static light because static lights can't change. Now, if this light is going to move like a flashlight, do you see everybody that it got like a little moving thingy on it? If an object is going to move, it's going to need to be movable. But if a light is only going to change color and intensity, as it says so in the icon right there in the mouse over, it doesn't need to be rebuilt. It's one of the benefits of stationary lights. It's why stationary light is the default. When you make a light, it comes in a stationary. Using a static light is a physical choice. But everything that I talked about from the static light still applies to the stationary light, including the need for a light mass importance volume if you are not using Lumen. I keep reminding everybody of Lumen because Lumen is going to be the new hotness, right? Also, I'll explain what's happening in kind of the next step as well. So, this is all well and good. We've explained kind of what's going on. I'm going to do a quick lighting build. It'll be fine. It's not going to be mad anymore. We talked about talking about stationary lighting, the benefits of stationary lighting, how that shadow is better. Let's talk very quickly now about movable lighting. Lumen is considered movable lighting, but for the purpose of this demo, for this week, because obviously we wanted a short week this week because of the holiday. Lumen is considered real time, but the way that Lumen works performs almost as well as a stationary slash static, or I should say it's static smaller, static slash stationary setup on modern hardware. If you do not have modern hardware, you're not going to get those performance numbers from Lumen. You just cannot. But as the hardware improves, as everybody starts getting more pipelined assets and better lighting solutions inside of games and better hardware in general, we're going to be able to use Lumen. And Lumen is considered a real-time, fully movable setup. When I mean fully movable, check this out. I'm going to set my light to movable. This one can stay stationary for now. And then I'm going to do a build because I just did a movable light. It's going to build because obviously we still have a light in here that is a stationary light and therefore requiring a build. But let me just say this. A movable light give it a sec. A movable light does not use light maps. A movable light does not use a light mass importance. Yes, these light maps are in here, but look what's happening. Look what's happening as it's updating. They're disappearing. Why? Because this does not require light maps. It's telling the engine, hey, look, I know there's something in the scene that probably needs a light map, but movable lights do not use light maps. Movable lights use cascaded shadow maps full time. And let me go ahead and load this up here. Show advanced shadow frustums. Wait, Mr. Figueroa, what happened to the little tiny shadow frustum? That yellow box right there is the shadow frustum on a movable light. Movable light is fully real-time light, calculated on every frame, on every tick. That's what movable light is. It is a dynamic cascade shadow. It is the best look, well, not the best looking shadow. If you spend a lot of time working in light mass, like I used to, under light mass settings, and I'll show you guys this in the next, in a future demo, you can get some sick looking lighting. Oh my goodness, can you get some sick looking lighting? Baking your lighting is gonna look better for renders. Let me say this specifically. Baking your lighting is gonna look better for renders than a fully movable light. For beginners, setting a fully movable light might be better. All of this is assuming that you are not using Lumen. If your computer can run Lumen and you are using Lumen, Lumen should be the thing that you light with, at least for now. And we'll talk more about Lumen probably next week. Well, not even probably next week. We will be talking more about Lumen next week because I need to break up the lighting into two parts because this is starting to get a little bit longer than I wanted it to. This is already up to like 2.5 hours, and I promised you guys a 2-hour class. But this is still really important, so I wouldn't be blabbering on about this if I didn't think it was important. It is important. Everything that I'm covering is the assumption for current gen games that are not currently using Lumen. There is no game out right now that is using Lumen. There is only a demo. Just one demo from Epic that is using Lumen. There is no other game. There is no way to test it out. Everything that's being made using Lumen is all Frontier stuff. Not a lot of people know how to get the best looking stuff out of it. Most of the stuff that is going to be current gen, including stuff that's already out using the Unreal Engine, utilized the current either light baking system, shadow maps, light maps, or light mass. Any variation of all of those. Not Lumen. All the stuff that's out right now is as good as it looks without Lumen. Lumen is just supposed to be an evolution of everything that we've covered, and even it has its own limitations. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to Show, Advanced, turn off the Shadow Frustums. With a movable light, when you have a movable light in the scene, I'm going to set that back down, you can move it, you can change the time of day, you can do everything that you want with it, It's never going to ask for a rebuild. But if you noticed, just like with a light that has no skylight, like I mentioned earlier at the very beginning of this, watch the difference here. I'm going to change this back to a stationary light, and then I'm going to do a quick build. A stationary light still has an opportunity to bounce some lighting around. It is considered a form of GI, global illumination, meaning that light is bouncing everywhere, and then the shadows are getting filled in somewhat, right? That's just kind of what happens when you are using a baked light. So I just changed this back to stationary. I'm doing another bake. Watch what happens. Give that a sec. It'll update here in a sec. Boom. Everything has some generalized lighting on it. But when we shift over to fully movable light and we do a bake and we throw away the light maps that we had already, as you'll see what happens, we don't get any kind of bounced lighting. At this point, we need to start considering what else we're going to do with our lighting. So let's say I'm going to turn this on, and this light is going to be baked. Move that a little bit out. We'll do another bake for that particular light. Again, you wouldn't bake every time that you make a change, right? In reality, what you would do is you'd make a bunch of changes, you'd set a preview, and baking your lighting is like the last thing you do once you make all of the big changes, right? That's just kind of how it works. So, Mr. Figueroa, why not set all your lights to movable? Because all lights don't need to be set to movable unless you are using Lumen. Lumen doesn't care. Lumen throws away the shadow maps and the light maps. Lumen doesn't care about any of the mapping stuff. It doesn't care about light mass. That's what all of that is. When you're using baking, it's called light mass. If you're using the swarm agent, it's light mass. That's what that system is called in Unreal. When you're using this method, which is the current gen method, as you can see, this one is going to be baked. If we go into world settings and we close the light mass settings and we open up our light maps, we see that I should probably have RGB on. I'll have it. No, I'll turn it on. We see that there is some color being baked into the scene. We see that there are light maps being generated. And we are generating some light maps. However, the light maps are only being generated from the one light that needs them, this light right here. Our fully movable light that has a little icon right here to show that it is movable is not going to require those light maps. And because it doesn't require the light maps, it needs, you see that we do have some bounced light over here, but it's not enough. Movable lights need a skylight. Now this light can also be set to its own mobility settings. In a lot of cases, this light will match its mobility settings to this light. So yes, we have a skylight. Yes, it can be baked as well. So you can apply everything that we've covered today to basically every type of light. But if we are doing a real-time lighting solution, we'd set all of our main lights to movable. We wouldn't need to bake because everything that has already been baked is the only light that needed to bake was this one right here. And these two can be set to movable. And notice how much nicer the shadow is under a fully movable setup. That's generally why beginners start with either stationary or movable light. Guys, I would strongly say stay away from static lighting. It's starting to become so retro where it's like, okay, only a handful of things are going to be using it anymore. Everything defaults to stationary. Stay stationary for this particular class. It's just good for you. Objects can be static, obviously, because that just means what the object's going to do. But as far as lighting is concerned, you should stick generally to you should stick generally to stationary and movable. Static is really only going to be useful if you need a light in a scene. And again, all of this is said assuming you're not using Lumen. Assuming you went into your project settings and you turn it all off, just like I showed you at the beginning, Lumen is not enabled on this right now. Next week, I'm going to cover all of the lighting scenarios for Lumen. Lumen is its own project, but it's actually more simple than everything I've explained here. You don't have to worry about light mass importance. You don't have to worry about anything like that. For lighting a scene like this, if I was going to light this using a stationary setup, meaning that I still wanted some amount of performance and I wasn't using Lumen, you see that my preview lighting is set up, you generally want to have, if you are doing an outdoor scene, a directional light, a skylight to fill in the shadows. You need both. And if you have any other lights that are going to need to be baked, that's totally fine. Now that I've changed the mobility on my key lights, my directional light, and my skylight, let's double check to make sure the directional light is set properly. Good, it's set up to directional light there. The sun is in the correct position now because I didn't move that shadow. Let's do a bake. Now, if I was doing a hardcore lighting setup, I would go into light mass settings, I would start making some changes. Those things would all be necessary, right? But generally speaking, if you are lighting an outdoor scene, most of your lights, again, this is without Lumen, most of your lights are going to be stationary. They perform the best, and they give a much, much nicer result. And if you still need a nicer result than this on the ground here, we can, in fact, go ahead. Let's bump that up to 1024. I'm going to keep staring at it. Let's do another bake. Just on that piece. Let's say I need a much, much nicer shadow for that because the bake is not working out. Okay. I'll give that a second to kind of do its thing. Boom. Much softer, not as pixelated, looks real good, looks real clean, looks nice. That shadow. So again, this is a baked light with a cascade shadow on it because both of these are set to what? Stationary, which means that the only object receiving a dynamic light is Walking Dude right here. Cool. And this works pretty good out of the box. One more time, and with emphasis, this is assuming the current distribution and understanding of lighting inside of Unreal. Lumen is a completely different system that ignores a good portion of everything that we talked about today. That is okay. Lumen is not going to be used for every single game from here on out. It just isn't. I am getting real tired of this autosave. Now we're good. Now it's fixed. Lumen is a completely separate system, and a system that I need to explain on its own, separate from this current system, because these two systems do not interact with each other. If you are using Lumen, you are not doing any of this. Lumen is a great out-of-the-box solution that works incredibly well, but it requires a completely different setup. For example, a real-time capture, right here. A post-process volume that uses Lumen Global Illumination and Lumen Reflections. As you can see, these are disabled for now. The ability to control the final gather quality. Let's see if I can get the different values here. Oh, I closed the information. Good. And each individual light needs to be set up for Lumen specifically. It doesn't necessarily adhere to the same mobility rules. So, next week, when I talk about building out scenes, we're going to build out a scene using the current technology and current gen iteration of what the Unreal lighting standard is supposed to be. But you guys are on the crack of an entirely new system that throws away a lot of this older stuff. No, I don't want to say it's older or redundant. It's not redundant, but it's, if you guys were to get hired tomorrow, a lot of places would want you to know Lumen for research purposes. There is no game currently in development, at least as far as I know, that is, at least not without Epic touching it, right? That is currently pivoting to use Lumen immediately. In fact, a lot of studios are being discouraged from jumping in and using it because it's not fully cooked. It's not ready. It's not ready for prime time. The engine will be shipped sometime next year. You guys will still be with me at that point. But a lot of things change when you shift to Lumen. So again, as a final caveat, everything that I've talked about here has been with Lumen disabled. I will talk about Lumen next week when we do demos related to Lumen. That's going to do it for this video. Let me double check to make sure that I've gotten everything that I need to cover about lighting, mobility, and etc. I've covered stationary lighting in this video. I covered shadows on movable objects are dynamic because they just agreed. I talked about movable lights. When would you use a movable light? When you want full real time and your team is not ready to transition over to Lumen. If your team and the game that you are producing is going to be on hardware that can handle it, it is worth having the conversation to do it with Lumen. Real-time, fully movable lighting is now transitioning into something that is much, much bigger and better than what is available by default without Lumen on. Fully movable lighting should be used if you are going to have a real-time lighting system with real-time global illumination and real-time like sun shifting and sun changing, maybe a daytime system. Those kinds of things can be really expensive. But fully movable, dynamic, frame-to-frame rendered shadows is very expensive currently. Lumen is supposed to be kind of a solution that creates a scenario where the shadows are not so expensive to produce, and yet you can build them out on your personal hardware without needing 5 GTX 6969s Titans, right? So Lumen is a completely separate system that I will cover next week. It is important, but so is this, because the studios that you can potentially get hired for are doing it this way still, all right? And I'm going to wrap up some things and stuff that I want to talk about next week, okay? So let's review. Lights have mobility settings. Each mobility setting has access to different lighting techniques. All of this is said without Lumen. Keep that in mind. Static lighting is the cheapest lighting. It doesn't create a dynamic shadow, but it does work to provide shadows on objects at a very, very cheap and highly performant method, but they look like crap. Stationary lights have access to both light maps and cascaded shadow maps. They cast a non-dynamic shadow, but it is still a cast shadow that is rendered by the engine and saved as something called a cascade shadow map. That gives you automatically a better looking shadow right out of the box, but still requires baking, still requires everything that we set up today. Fully movable lighting is fully dynamic shadows. That's it, fully dynamic shadows. However, is now in some ways being made redundant by the existence of Lumen. Cool. We talked about the adaptive eye and its effect on the engine, its effect on lighting scenarios and lighting calculations inside of buildings. I'm going to select this object again, and I'm going to turn off. We're not inside of it, so it's actually a lot easy to turn off the infinite sense of bound. We see automatically that our adaptive eye is starting to modulate the scene in a way that might not be accurate to what we want to be seeing. I like to make mine a little faster myself. But as you can see, the adaptive eye does have an effect. We have not yet covered what is going on back here. We have not yet covered Lumen, but we will in a future demo. Alright guys, I think I'm going to have one video. I feel like I do need to give you guys some homework. I know it's not full yet, but what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to package up this project. I'm going to doll it up a little bit so that everybody gets the same project as me, and then everybody will be able to download it. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make you guys do a static light and a stationary light, and I'm going to have you guys submit some screenshots for that. We'll see. Check out the homework tab. I reserve the right to completely redo this, but please, by all means, check the homework tab. If there is anything else I want to add, I reserve the right to shorten everything to make it so that you guys can do this like in a weekend. But that's going to do it for this particular video. I will see you guys in the next one.